All right, welcome back into the Family Section podcast, episode number 7. Today we're going to talk about family finance. Myself and Greg Bottenhorn of Jazzby, the family finance app and debit card for kids. So, and obviously the podcast brought to you by Jazzby. So, Greg, why don't you lead us in today? Because I know that this is a topic that lots of families struggle with and deal with, which is the impact that family finances can have on a family's relationships.
Yeah. So, I mean, look, family finance is a subject near and dear to my heart. It's kind of what we focus on at Jazzby, obviously. There's a lot that goes into family finance. So I think if you ask pretty much any marriage counselor, anybody that talks about marriage, they'll tell you that money is one of the biggest issues that couples tend to have. And I think there's a lot of things that go into that. We'll dig into it a little bit today, but it also gets down to our kids and what we're teaching our kids about money and the examples specifically that we set for our kids. We've talked about this in previous episodes with sports and things like this, but with family finance, it's huge. And I do have kind of some thoughts on why that is and how we can do better. But I think it's a subject that's important to a lot of our listeners, right? It's especially this day and age with how much prices have gone up, and the kind of weird job market, which again I think we did an episode on towards the beginning, but how people are working today is different. So I think it's a good area for us to give some info to our listeners.
Yeah, look, it's probably, I remember talking to someone once who said it's the single greatest stressor on any family is money. Everybody fights about money. How much, and aside from, spending only what you can spend, and obviously that involves budgets and things like that. I think also we all come from different environments where how we were taught about money. My mother was really, really emphasized saving money. My parents did not spend a lot. And, that can relate to, obviously connects to a lot of other things, life experiences, your ability to enjoy life. So, and there is a balance there, right? And I presume that this is the kind of stuff you're talking about that, balancing that, trying to have everybody understand what goes into building a family budget. And at the same time, being able to spend enough that, I say spend enough so that you can enjoy yourself a little bit.
Yeah. Well, Tony, I think you hit on something really important there, and it's how this has changed generationally, right? And certainly the examples that we grew up with, and I was the same way. Look, I grew up with a single mom, which I've said here before, but being her struggling and working hard to make sure we stayed, and I say middle class. Taught me a lot about money in terms of how you budget it and what needs versus wants, and sometimes just having to say no and all that stuff, right? And to be honest, as when I became a parent, because of that, I kind of tried to go the other way. In terms of making sure my kids got the wants and not just the needs. And I know for a fact that early on, I didn't set some of the best examples for my kids in terms of how this goes. So I've really tried to do better, but making sure that my kids do better than I did even, which is always one of the goals of being a parent, right? So I think all of that stuff is important. I'll tell you what I think, Tony, is one of the biggest drivers of this, and it's debt and our views on debt and why we have it, right? So, again, this is a generational thing. So I'll go back to my grandparents, and my grandfather always used to tell me a story of how he never owed anybody a dime in his entire life. When he built a second vacation home on a lake once and had to borrow $500 from his brother-in-law for some materials, and didn't sleep until he got that $500 paid back, right? And it's the only money he ever owed anybody his whole life, and he was super proud of that. And now we fast forward to today, and that's it's unheard of, right? I mean, everybody's got debt. Everybody borrows money for different things. And it's totally changed, and it's impacted, our quality of life and what we live for. We're basically working, we're busting our asses to work now to pay somebody else back for the money that we had to borrow from them. And it's kind of crazy if you think about it.
Oh, totally. Look, and again, I would say my parents were probably more like your grandparents, Greg, in that. And again, I don't know what generation your family first got rooted here. In my case, I'm first generation American. My parents are both immigrants. So they came over, didn't really have two nickels to rub together. My father was 19 when he arrived in New York. And basically, largely uneducated. I mean, not more through than like the sixth grade or so, maybe a shade beyond that. And then, he was a blue collar worker, and my mother, they saved everything. They did not like go out to dinner a lot and do things like that. And my mother did not like debt. She did not like debt at all. Her goal was always to pay down that mortgage as quickly as possible. She didn't like the idea of owing anybody anything. And in our world, it's really not realistic. And to me, one of the big changes has been the cost of education, right? So people who go to school now can't help but come out with debt just because of the astronomical cost of education. And so, look, a little debt's okay, but it just makes it harder for people to really advance in the world. And look, like you said, I'm not the greatest example for my kids either. My wife recently started chewing me out a little bit because she says, "How many pairs of sneakers do you have?"
I have 100, so I know exactly what you mean there.
Yeah, and she's right. She's right. And
Yeah.
so, I tend to, when I get stressed, and this, relates to human behavior and things like that. When I get stressed, my solution sometimes is, well, I need something in reserve, and I'll buy myself a backup pair of sneakers, or rather than actually taking the time to say, no, I don't need three pairs of sneakers. I got two, that's plenty, or I got one, that's plenty. So I tend to accumulate stuff, and and it's really an awful habit.
Tony, you and me both. I think they call it retail therapy, right? I'm the same way. I get stressed. I'm like, you know what? I just need to go out and like clear my head and buy something. You can see my watch collection behind me. I've got 250 watches. So I definitely feel your pain on that one.
Yeah, look, and again, and sometimes some of that stuff is like, like I know we've touched on the idea of mental health, but sometimes your happiness is worth something, right? So
Yeah.
like if it just makes you a little bit happier during a time where you're really busy, that's fine. So long as those pleasures to me are, simple pleasures, they're not extravagant. You're not putting anybody's long-term well-being, whether it be or long-term access to an education or things like that. You're not putting your family in any sort of risk financially. To me, it's okay. They're annoying to the other people
Yeah.
in the relationships, but I wouldn't say that we are reckless or frivolous spenders, but I would also say that, I certainly can be a lot better at, eliminating some of the fat for sure.
Yeah, but I'll tell you what else, Tony. There's a big difference there, and it's that, and I assume it's the same with you, right? So the money that I go out and do spend is money that I have available, and everybody's got to look at it and say, what you can afford, right? But the key is I don't use debt to make those purchases, so I don't borrow money from somebody else to make them. I'm actually, one of the things that I'm proudest of is that I have figured out from an early age how I could be debt free, and I make sure that I don't run up debt. Again, going back to my grandfather, this guy was amazing. He taught me so much in life. But one of the things was he always used to tell me, wealthy people earn interest, they don't pay interest. And so I've always tried to live by that. And so I invest in things where I'm earning interest, and I don't run up debt where I pay interest. But part of this too is, we, again, going back to teaching our kids these lessons, right? So I went through this recently with my 19-year-old daughter. So she's in college. She's trying to build up a credit score at this point, which, as we know, is super important in life. We'll probably do a whole episode on some of these things that we never teach our kids that end up being super important. But building a good credit score is one of those things. And so she's car shopping, and she has the money to buy a car in cash. And I was talking to her about it and said, honestly, if one of your goals is to build a credit score, you're actually better off getting a small car loan.
Right.
And again, we're teaching our kids by these tools that are super important to them in life, like a credit score, that they have to accrue debt in order to build that up. And that's just the way the system's been built, right? Like it or not, that's the way the system's been built. You have to show that you're credit worthy. So, and like a lot of other things, the deck is kind of stacked against you in some of this stuff. And you mentioned it was school costs. Like it's crazy. We're pricing middle class families even at this point out of school, but certainly people that struggle or live paycheck to paycheck. Like I don't know how these families deal with school. Like I've got a kid in college right now. It ain't cheap. So I don't know. It's really amazing.
Well, yeah, no, look at and some of the, the loans with education are ridiculous too. So like, look, but to your point, there are opportunities where like, you hear it all the time, 0% financing on a home project for 2 years. Okay. that's a good opportunity to sort of say, okay, that's basically free money. I can do a big project in my home, budget it out for a couple of years without having to pay any interest, to your point, or very, very little interest if you're buying a new car. And as you said, like, you're building a credit score, what have you along the way. And all those things are valuable too. So, but I like that, uh, wealthy people earn interest, they don't pay interest.
Mhm.
And so I don't know if zero interest is always all that realistic, but I think that it is, low interest is realistic, right? So keep that to a real minimum. And again, I'm no financial expert. I'm just telling you that my parents had very simple philosophies and ideas when they first got here and gave me some great advice along the way. Just to give you a quick example, my first home was a 2-family home. I was in my late 20s. My parents helped me buy it. They encouraged me to buy it. And it was the price was right at the time. It was a house that needed a little bit of work. My father was handy. But what it allowed me to do really was live in one unit, rent free, and the other unit paid my mortgage.
Yep.
So, what I was really able to do during that time was build equity, and without really, dipping into my salary and things like that. Cause at that stage of my life, I wasn't making a lot of money.
Yep.
And, and that obviously changes as you get older, but so do the expenses. So, it's just, I had good teachers. My parents were good teachers on that sort of stuff and put us in a position to succeed.
I had great teachers too, but both my mother as well as my grandparents, just amazing. One thing you said though, Tony, that I know our listeners are thinking, and it's well, you guys don't have to worry about money. I mean, come on, this is crazy. But I'll tell you what, I have this conversation with people all the time, and it's true. Like, it doesn't really matter what you get to for an income level. Like, your expenses tend to follow, unless you're like, look, if you're
Correct.
Elon Musk or something, I get it. But otherwise, you have a bigger house. Your spouse spends a little bit more money. Your kids expect a little bit more. You drive a little bit of a nicer car. And I get these are nice problems to have, right? But what I'm saying is that a lot of the same trouble tends to follow you regardless of what your income is, because
Correct.
your outgoing expenses always rise accordingly, it seems.
Yeah. Well, that's totally right. And you want a certain lifestyle, and then, you always say, well, we could get a little bit more. Well, we could do this, we could do that. And then, but like you said, the expenses go up. So I almost think there's like it's all based on a percentage basis. Yes, you can, as you start to make more, that's great. You also start to spend more. And so you end up on a percentage basis, you have very similar problems. So just my 2 cents, but look, and again, it does create stress in the house from time to time. Where my wife and I are both pretty good about, we don't hound each other about the small stuff. Because if you do that, that can make your day-to-day existence really kind of hard, right? So, and we talk about the big stuff all the time. So communication's a big part of it too, and making sure that, okay, if we have a little extra money, do we want to put it towards our mortgage, or how do we feel about that? How are we going to manage it over the long term? And I think those are all discussions that everybody has.
Yeah, I'll tell you what, you're absolutely right in the way that you guys handle it. It sounds like is right. I'll tell you, when I was 22, I guess, is when I had my first what I'll call kind of real job, right? Where you're making okay money, and you're going into an office every day and all this stuff. So I'll tell you the things that I did right off the bat. One, I knew that I didn't want to work every day for the rest of my life, so I started maxing out my 401k right away. Again, 22 years old, I'm thinking about retirement, and I'm maxing out my 401k from day one. So I did that. It really set me off on a good kind of path, right? The other thing that I did is I figured out how I could live as inexpensively as possible and started just paying off debt right away. So, like, I think at that time I had, again, I was a stupid young kid, and I'd run up some credit card debt, like significant amounts of credit card debt. And I had a car loan and all the other stuff. And I said, okay, this is crazy. I'm getting out of this. And I started putting like large chunks of my income towards just getting it all paid off. I knew I wanted to live debt free, and I knew I wanted to prepare for retirement from when I was 22. So anybody that's listening, again, if you have kids, if you are still young, like, those are really important lessons, right? Live below your means while you're young and before you have kids and all this other fun stuff, and just get debt paid off, get start preparing yourself from a savings perspective. I'm sure we've all seen the stories about how if you put away $150 every paycheck from 21 to 27, you're going to have 1.8 million when you retire. Like, there's all sorts of examples out there. You can Google them. But I'm telling you, this stuff works. Compound interest is amazing.
Yeah, it's never too early to start thinking longer term, right?
Yeah.
Like, you have a tendency at those ages to say, I'm young. Yeah. The earlier you start, the better off you are. And, but again, it's not like we're financial experts, Greg, which,
Yeah.
I mean, maybe it makes some sense to bring one in. What do you think?
I was just going to say the same thing. I think maybe we could bring in someone that maybe knows a little bit more about this than you and me.
Okay. So would you like to introduce her?
Sure. Why don't we take a quick break, and when we come back, I'll give her a great little intro like usual.
Again, someone you should listen to far more than Greg and myself. But just a quick reminder that you can find the Family Section podcast on the podcast page of 985thesportshub.com, also on the 98.5 app. While you're there, be sure to check out all the other original podcasts available from Boston's Home for Sports. Podcasts are at bpodstudios.com as well. That's B as in Beasley, and Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and most importantly, jazzby.com/podcast. And Jazzby is with 2 S's. It sounds like Z's, but it's S's. jassby.com/podcast. Also our YouTube channel, and click, rate, and subscribe. I remind all of you to do that as well. So Greg and I will be right back with our guest after this.
Welcome back to the Family Section. So before we went to break, Mazz and I were talking about a lot of the ways that money impacts families and spending and how all that works. So we said we'd bring in an expert guest that could talk a little bit better about it than we did. We have. I'd like to introduce Rachel Rivera. Rachel is an Air Force veteran turned entrepreneur whose thriving personal finance business is transforming the way that women manage money for themselves and for their families. Rachel's company, Beautiful Budget, has made waves with its first budgeting workbook, launched about 9 months ago. It's got nearly 3,000 copies sold. It features a unique template that Rachel developed herself several years back to change the financial tide in her own home. And so now her mission has become teaching women, commonly busy moms, how to manage money with wealth and fulfillment in mind. A couple quick things that I think are really interesting. So Rachel has made this a full-time job, kind of goes back to the side gigs discussion Mazz and I had a few weeks back. But she's also grown her Instagram following to over 50,000 followers. That's growing pretty quickly. So clearly people are listening and paying attention. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you so much. Hi, Tony. Hi, Greg. How you doing?
Hi, Rachel. Thanks for joining us.
Absolutely.
Did I miss anything in your intro there?
That was great. No, thank you. Thank you so much for that intro.
Yeah, of course. So, Rachel, before we brought you in, Mazz and I were just talking about money and how it impacts families, and I think you'd agree it's one of the biggest issues I think that is created in relationships. But we were talking about, sometimes it doesn't really matter income because your expenses go up, and it's all about percentages, which I think fits pretty well into the whole budget idea. So we'll get to budget because I actually have a lot of questions about that. But first of all, I want to talk about the struggles that families have with money and how that impacts relationships. Kind of how have you seen that happen? Is this why you kind of started this process back in 2016? Why don't you just tell us how you got started with this?
Yeah, sure. I'd really point to 2 kind of pivotal moments or situations that bring me to where I am today. The first one, 2016. Going through a divorce, no savings, no investing, lots of debt going on in that situation, and was really just spending out of insecurity. And I was at a really low point. I finally just reached a point where I said, this is enough. I was making good money. I was a young Air Force officer at the time, but I had nothing to show for it, which was really frustrating. And so that was kind of a key turning point. And then fast forward a few years, I remarry, we start having kids, and I just kind of realized my Air Force career was not really going to be a good fit for me. Motherhood and being what was actually a dual military couple. My husband was also active duty. He only recently got out. That was really hard. Military lifestyle is quite tough. And so once I kind of looked up and realized this is probably not going to be my my big girl job forever. So what's the next one going to be? That kind of caused me to look inward and say, what do I really enjoy? I love teaching. I love budgeting. I had now seen a lot of transformation in my money management, a lot of success there. So I started sharing it on Instagram, created a little blog, and it's just blossomed since then. Introduced the workbook, and that's really just been, that's what allowed me to take it full time. And now that's what I focus on, is helping women kind of steer their families towards financial success.
So just quickly, Rachel, because you may have seen me as you started to speak, I started futzing around on my phone because I was looking for your Instagram account. So what is your handle on Instagram?
Sure. It's beautiful.budget.
Okay. So I was going to say, because I looked you up by your name, but I'll find I was going to follow you right away. But when you say you early on that your spending was a lot based on insecurity, like elaborate on that a little. Because I just said to Greg a second ago, and I don't know if you heard it, that when I get stressed out or distracted, or, I go out and I'll say, like, my wife gave me grief recently because I have like 6 pairs of sneakers,
Right.
and I bought myself some. She says, how many pairs of sneakers do you need? And she's right. She's totally right. And I found that I got on this little splurge where all of a sudden I said, oh, I like these and I like those, and I bought them all, and so is this the kind of thing you're talking about, or something different?
That's absolutely it. The divorce I was in this new lifestyle of just kind of like, oh, I'm on my own, and I had more money to myself. Now, interestingly enough, I was actually paying spousal support. We didn't have kids. My ex-husband and I didn't have kids, but I was paying that alimony, and it was a costly divorce, but I still, I wanted to kind of come into my own, and I wanted to kind of increase my confidence. And I was doing it superficially. I was doing it through buying a new car. I bought a black Mustang, and I just thought I was just the cutest little thing. And it just, yeah, it got out of hand, definitely.
Yeah.
So.
Greg, go ahead.
So
I'm sorry. I didn't know.
No, I was just going to say, what are some of those things? So you said, okay, this isn't going to work for me. I've got to do some better things. What were some of those kind of initial things that you did to kind of get yourself out of this? And then I assume became the foundation for the workbook.
Absolutely. I really started to, I had a budget at the time that all this was happening. I had a little spreadsheet and I was jotting things down, but I started to budget with intention. What is a goal that I have? What do I want to do with this student loan debt? What do these numbers look like? What do they mean? Instead of just staring at them and crunching numbers. And I just kind of evaluated, what is it that I want long-term? I do plan to remarry. I plan to have kids. I want to be in a certain financial situation by that point. So let me really get this straight. Let me learn my money, what's coming in, what's going out. Started recording that a little bit more intentionally, and having a strategy for debt payoff and for saving and investing. That was really crucial to changing the tide.
So what would you say? I know we've got listeners that are kind of hearing this, and my guess is that a lot of them have tried this and it hasn't worked out. So what are some of the mistakes that people make when they do sit down with a spreadsheet like you're talking about? My guess, because as we know, right, like a lot of budgeting always sounds great, but a lot of people can't seem to stick to it. And my guess is it has to do with how much they make versus how much they want to spend. And sorry, Tony, you want to chime in there?
No. I was just shifting my seat. Go ahead.
Oh, there you go. So I would guess that these are some of the common things, right? So what are the mistakes people make, and how do we get past them?
You definitely hit a big one, the lifestyle creep. Maybe you get a little pay bump, and all of a sudden now you're spending more in accordance with that pay bump instead of increasing the saving, increasing the investing. And I think lifestyle creep to a certain degree it's okay. It's okay to kind of celebrate the fact that you've got that promotion, that you're earning a little bit more, and maybe you treat yourself once more per month to something that you truly love. I think that's totally fine, but it's when that difference is fully made up in increasing your spending. And another mistake I think people make is when there is another stakeholder involved. So when we're talking about a married couple, when we're talking about household finances, that the communication is lacking, and that they're just kind of seeing red because they're saying, well, I'm a spender and that person is a saver, or they're making absolute statements like you always do this or you never do this. Those are really dangerous. And so really taking time to talk through, to think through, how are we going to manage our money together? Because sometimes, and oftentimes, people reach that point of needing to change the tide when they are already married and kind of making mistakes, and they want to get better. And so it's got to be a situation of, let's sit down and figure out what do we both want, and then inevitably there will be things that you want as individuals, and crafting a plan that accommodates both of you is possible. It's just, I think the template that you follow and what you kind of use to guide you is going to play a big role. And do you actually keep up with it? Do you create this budget and follow it? I think for a lot of people, they just don't have something to guide them in that process. And that was a big push for me to create the workbook and get it out there into the hands of people around the world.
Okay. And how long now, again, has the workbook been out there? That's been several months, right?
It launched last July. Yes.
Last July. Okay. And so, look, don't give away all your secrets, but, just give us an idea of the kind of the thing that people could expect to learn or, be exposed to just by, your philosophies.
Sure. Rather than an approach of, hey, let's do one thing at a time, which I know is pretty commonly taught, focus on your debt, then focus on your emergency fund, or, these different things. It's one at a time. Rather than that approach, this is more of, let's balance. Let's achieve balance here. Let's make sure your basic needs are met, obviously, first and foremost, but we got to build an emergency fund. If the pandemic taught us nothing, like, we have to be ready for curveballs. So that emergency fund is next. And then let's accelerate the debt payoff. Maybe you've got high interest debt, specifically like that credit card debt. It needs to be a priority. And then you start shifting into saving, investing, and doing those things that you really enjoy, which I call the fulfillment portfolio. So all of this is built into the template, and it's meant to follow a checklist. I mean, that's how my brain works, is checklist and some sort of order. And that's what my kind of framework gives you, is let's go at this in a way that makes sense and that will actually allow you to gain some financial wins, and then kind of spread your money out across these areas in a balanced way. You can still have fun while you pay off debt. You can still, you can invest while you're doing these other things. You can invest for your retirement and for your kids' futures. You can do these things simultaneously. And I love that notion of let's multitask that money to get after multiple goals at the same time.
So, Rachel, what about for the situations where, because I get it if you're just kind of starting out, because you can really kind of build the way that you spend money based on that, right? The house you buy or the car that you buy or things like that. What about for people who are already down that spending path, right? So, Joe, who makes good money, bought a really nice house, has a nice car, his wife drives a really nice car, his kids go to private schools, and they're like, oh boy, we are in trouble. We've run up too much debt. How do those people best get out of that? Because they can't just necessarily sell their house and buy a smaller house. So how does that work?
Yeah, I always tell people to kind of start with, first and foremost, like, why? Why do you want to turn things around? You're going to need a really durable purpose to get through this. I mean, budgeting it's a lifestyle. And I know it gets a bad rap, but it needs to become your lifestyle. And so at the heart of that is, okay, well, why do you want to turn things around? And usually what you hear is, well, I want things to be different for my kids. I want to be able to retire early. I want to travel the world, in my 50s and from then on. And these are good. These are those things that can help keep you motivated. But once you have that defined, it's, as I mentioned before, it's learn your money. What is coming in and what is going out? And obviously if it's a starting point of we're exceeding, like we're turning to credit cards because we're spending more than we earn, then that's going to be our starting point. We've got to dial back the expenses and get to that point. But it's learning your money. What is your income? Look at your pay stub. Like, are you contributing to a 401k? Is a 401k available to you? Are you paying taxes on that money now? Are you paying on it later? Really just starting to analyze every little thing that makes up your financial landscape so that you're giving yourself a chance to do something different going forward. So that's really the starting point. And I've had lots of clients and people who have purchased the workbook who are they're swimming in debt. And really what it takes is it's a strategy, needing a strategy. Are you going to tackle the credit card first, which is usually what I recommend, get that high interest stuff gone. And then you can let up a little bit once you've got lower interest debt left. But it's strategy, it's learning your money, being willing to look in the mirror and say, I've made some mistakes, but it doesn't have to be this way forever.
So yeah, I mean, look, as you speak, I find myself sort of nodding, saying, when I was in my 20s, I had credit card debt and I would carry it over. And, now I pay my credit cards in full, right? So like
Yes.
I don't want any interest at all on my credit cards, but that's something that you learn at a young age, like, oh my gosh, the credit card interest rates are outrageous.
Mhm.
Outrageous what they charge you. And again, when you're young, half the people don't even see that. So you mentioned you got remarried and you now have children, right?
Yes.
How old are your kids?
4 and 2.
Okay, so your kids are still very, very small.
Yes.
But have you thought at all about how you're going to teach your kids about money, or what kind of tools you want to use with your kids about money? Because as Jazzby is our presenting sponsor, and Jazzby is a family finance app and the whole premise is how to teach your kids or financial literacy and teach them how to manage and budget their money. And so I'm just curious as to how much thinking you've already done. If you haven't, maybe you haven't, and that's okay too, because they're still young. But whether you've gone down that road at all yet.
I have my 4-year-old, our son, he's starting to get to the point where he understands this notion of, we go somewhere and we pay for something, we hand over that money or we swipe that card and then we receive something in return. And he's counting higher. And so I'm starting to really think about how can I teach him this notion of there's a finite amount of money. That's the part he doesn't get, is that, it doesn't go on forever. Mommy and daddy work so that we can afford these things. And I'm really just trying to go ahead and teach him now, even though he's very young, that talking about money is okay. Like transparent conversations between my husband and me about money. We try to kind of have those in front of him just so he knows it's okay to talk about it. So that's one thing. But I was very happy to hear about Jazzby and that platform and a way to kind of introduce these financial principles to kids. So I'm starting to munch on it. I haven't quite figured out the whole solution, but definitely wanting to teach him that, that there's a finite amount of money and, it's earned, and kind of having a plan for how you spend it. You don't just spend it all. Let's talk about what we might do with it. He's starting
So
to get there.
Greg, you and I had this conversation. I don't remember, but do your kids get an allowance? I think we lost him. I don't know if Greg can hear
Sorry,
me
I
or
think.
not. Oh, there you
Yeah,
go.
I think I hit my cough button wrong. So yes, my kids do get an allowance. Although I'll tell you, this is something that I've struggled with a little bit, but I make sure to do it now because I think what Rachel was just saying is dead on. Kids have to learn the whole idea of earning money and what that means and what you do for that money and that there's a finite amount of it. I think the way you said it's perfect, right? So I'm a big believer that we need to let kids manage a small portion, at least, of their own money so that they understand these concepts and that they have a list of things that they do in order to earn that, right? So and Rachel, maybe this is your workbook 2.0. Your next one is how to work with kids on this stuff, because I think it's fascinating. And Tony and I were talking in the first segment about our kids go off into the world. There's all these things that are super important that they know about, yet we've never really talked about in school or at home. And so giving them an opportunity to, go in the store and buy a loaf of bread and understand the process. And I think you touched on this earlier of I hand somebody money, whether it be a card or cash or whatever, and they hand me something back with a receipt that says I bought it, and I go, and how to find that, and just these little things that you can do. I talk about, and sorry, it's a long answer to a short question, Mazz, but I tell this cleat story all the time. And the idea is the CEO of Jazzby actually has these two boys. They play football, and every year they go out and buy cleats, and it was $100 a piece. And they go out and they pick them out based on brand or color or whatever. Bring them up to the front. Dad swipes the credit card. Boys go home with cleats. Everybody's happy. And so one year he said, "Hey, I'm going to give you each. Cleats cost $100 each. I'm going to give you each $100 on Jazzby. Go buy whatever cleats you want, and whatever money's left over, you can keep." And these kids became educated consumers overnight. Right. They no, it wasn't about the brand. It wasn't about the color. It was, okay, how can I get the cleats that I need for the least amount of money? right? They started looking at sales and functions and all this other stuff. And they ended up buying cleats. I think one was $55 and one was $60 for the cleats. So they saved a bunch off what they usually spent, pooled the remaining money, bought a video game. But more importantly, both kids learned a pretty important lesson about being a consumer and how it works and how to find deals. And those little things, Rachel, I think you'd agree that we can do for our kids to give them real world experience in terms of how this stuff works is super important.
Yeah, absolutely. And then just kind of building on that. I mean, I think introducing an allowance, I plan to do the same and kind of get that going. And then just building on it as they get older. This notion of, I mean, you guys mentioned interest earlier and like credit cards. And I think that kids are able to, consume that as they get older. And, I spent some time as a high school math teacher after my Air Force career before taking my business full time. And I would have peers who would say, I know everybody wants us to teach these kids money, but they're not going to listen. They're not going to retain it. And I disagree with that. But I would also say, even just by teaching it and talking about it, you're promoting transparency around it, because it's become so taboo. And especially in adult circles and, in my circle of girlfriends, it's kind of hard for them to talk openly about money. I think it starts in the home. I think it starts when you're younger. It's okay to talk about it.
Oh, I think you're dead on.
Go ahead, Greg. I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I was going to talk about how money has become taboo in the home, because it's so true. And we need to get past that so that our kids learn. And I'll tell you what, Generation Z specifically, though, they have a desire to learn about this stuff and to be better. They saw some of the mistakes that a lot of millennials made in terms of money. And Generation Z has decided they want to be better. So that's a good sign already. Sorry, Mazz, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, Rachel, I think one of the things you're talking about is people are afraid to be called cheap. Right? It's like, well, that person's cheap. Well, maybe they're frugal, or, and look, and maybe they are cheap, which is fine too, because they have to be. Like, but I agree that it's sort of a third rail with a lot of people to talk about money, and they don't want to talk about it in a household. It can even sort of be unspoken. So, I totally agree. The transparency part of it, to me, is critical. So as you were talking, you said your business, and I mentioned the workbook, but I'm guessing you also consult people on money. Is that what, sort of as an advisor?
I do. Earlier this year, I started a one-on-one coaching program. It's pretty thorough, as opposed to just kind of bite-sized sessions. It really is kind of that one session to rule them all, where, I help you build your budget using my framework. And then we sit down and talk about, how do you uphold this budget, first of all, but then, your debt payoff roadmap. And when do you want to retire? Let's get your husband in on the call. When do you guys want to retire? What numbers would you guys need in order to get there? I love getting really in the weeds and just, devoting almost a whole day. It ends up being a 3.5-hour session where we sit down and we get very deep. We get our hands dirty and talk about, all areas of their finances. And that way they can walk away with the confidence and a roadmap to execute. But yes, I did start that earlier this year, the one-on-ones.
And just, if you don't mind me asking, what did you do in the Air Force?
I worked in cybersecurity. So totally different area. I majored in math out of University of Oklahoma, and then they picked me up as a cyber officer, and I had a blast. It's a great time. It's where I met my husband. So
that's awesome.
Yeah.
So how can people find you, Rachel?
Absolutely. So I'm most active on Instagram, and my handle there is at beautiful.budget. Starting to pick up a little bit more on YouTube, same handle, and TikTok as well, beautiful.budget.
Well, I did just follow you on Instagram. You'll be happy to know.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you. And look, as we often find in these discussions, I know, Greg, if you had anything else you wanted to toss in here at the end or not. So just before I do that, Greg, was there anything else you wanted to hit on?
Like I always say, Tony, there's always more I could hit on, but I think we're good.
Well, so that's what I was just going to say, is we find, Rachel, that as we've been talking to people, that oftentimes we say we may have you back because there are other things we want to get to that we couldn't necessarily do without keeping you here for 2 hours, So, and obviously everybody has busy lives, but thank you for your time. And we do at some point, we look forward to having you back. If you're up for it, we'll check in, and good luck with the workbook.
That's awesome. Thank you both for having me. It was great talking to you guys.
Thanks, Rachel.
Absolutely. So just quickly a reminder again that you can find the Family Section podcast on the podcast page at 985thesportshub.com, on our app as well. And most importantly at jassby.com, jassby.com/podcast, as well as BPod Studios, as B as in Beasley, .com, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, YouTube as well. Click, rate, and subscribe. Be sure to follow Rachel as well. We thank her for her time, and we'll catch you the next time on the Family Section podcast.
Bye, everybody.